So the first one is asking about an 11th grade student. I'm not sure if this is rising 11th grade or rising 12th grade. So if you could clarify in the Q&A, that would be great. And he has no math competitions and no standout math activities, but I believe the student does want to study math, wants to major in math, right? He is president of the school math club. I think that's a pretty standout math activity. And Science Bowl, right? If he applies to UC Berkeley, should his first choice major be undecided? Will undecided major have a better chance to get in than applying for a math major directly? Well, here's the thing. Berkeley and UCLA don't really accept people. The acceptance rate isn't tied to the major, right? So what I've been told from admissions people at Berkeley and UCLA is that their admissions rates are tied to the college that you're applying to. That's part of the reason why they separated majors like data science and computer science to the new college of computing, right? Because there were too many people applying. So like if they're applying to the College of Letters and Science, LNS at Berkeley, that's pretty much the same acceptance rate no matter what major you pick. So applying undecided isn't really going to benefit you just because you're applying undecided. You can really just put math if you want to. But what you should do, though, is if there's not enough sort of evidence to build upon for math, you could go for something else that maybe there's more evidence for if you think that would project the student as a stronger student. But I think president of math club is pretty substantial in and of itself, right? Especially if they're, pretty high level in terms of math. Another thing they could still do between now and when they apply is they can take like an even higher level math class. Like sometimes if a student is already in calculus BC by, let's say, 11th grade, they can take something like multivariable calculus or linear algebra to make their profile look more impressive for math. Math competitions are nice if you have it, but it's not really necessary for applying for a math major. So I think with their profile, they can apply for math. But if they could even apply for applied mathematics if you feel like the higher level math necessarily isn't there. So there are a lot of other options that they can look for. Many colleges will also have combinations of like mathematics plus something else, right? So if you feel like they may not be as competitive in their pure math credentials, there are other options. But at the end of the day, like I said, Berkeley, their acceptance rate is really just tied to their overall college that you're applying for, not as opposed to the separate major itself. Okay. Next is if a student accidentally opened a Common App account, can the student cancel the account? You can, but you probably don't really need to because it rolls over automatically for when the Common App goes active starting on August 1st. So all the information you have there will just port it over. You can always just change the information there. I believe it's tied to the email address that you use, but just in case the ID number like becomes conflicting, if you open up a second account, you can always just go ahead and ask College Board, not College Board, sorry, Common App. There's usually a support line that you can contact for them to sort of switch or remove the other account if you open up a new one, right? So it shouldn't really be a big deal. Okay, next is will Stanford count in the 12th grade GPA? If you're applying for regular decision, yes, right? So and this goes for almost all private schools, right? They will still be able to accept your 12th grade first semester grades because that's part of what's required. Your counselor at school will send in something called a mid-year report that includes your first semester GPA. So Stanford, much like other private schools, will see that GPA. Now, for the UCs, they don't because the filing period is ends November 30th. Plus, they've already been explicit about saying they don't really factor in your 12th grade grades. But for Stanford, they certainly will. Okay. Next, if a student's sports reaches about the D3 level, how does the student apply for university? Well, generally speaking, you would want to talk to your school's coach first and then try to see if you can get advice in terms of how to go about reaching out to different college coaches, right? So if they feel like you could potentially be like, it could be a plus factor in your acceptance or your admissions process, they will let you know, right? So beyond that, the application process would be very similar. You would just need to sort of establish a line of communication with the coach. Next is students want to apply to Ivy League college this October. Do you have any good suggestions? That's kind of really difficult for me because I don't really have much context in terms of what would fit their interest or their profile. So it's best for you to do your own research in terms of which Ivy League schools you'd be interested in. If you mean this October in terms of like early action, early decision. You could certainly check the most recent acceptance rates online, right? So if you are thinking of trying to get the biggest boost in terms of your chances of getting in, and you're just hoping to get into an Ivy League school, then of course you do want to check out the schools that have early decision because it tends to have the biggest boost compared to the early action schools. Like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton have single choice early action, so the acceptance rate's got to be relatively low. But if you're looking at a school like a Dartmouth or Brown for early decision, that's definitely going to give you a bigger boost. So if that's generally what we're asking, I would suggest then looking at those schools. But then you also have to factor in the fit, which of the Ivies are good for your major and everything. So it's not an easy thing to answer without much other context or information. Okay. Next is, what grade should my kid start preparing for his college application? Well, it depends on what you mean by the actual college application itself. If you're talking about the application process, like the essays and filling out the application, we typically start that process by second semester of a student's junior year. But if you mean preparing for college applications, including things like activities, testing, and everything, I mean, generally speaking, you want to be doing that even as early as middle school, right? Planning ahead, trying to figure out which activities, are going to be good for you, what fits into your profile. But in terms of the pure actual application process itself, usually second semester junior year, because we want to be able to use that summer to get a head start working on applications and essays already, so that by August 1st, which is when the Common App goes live for that particular application cycle, students will have already worked on some of the preliminary stuff, so it's not going to be as stressful for them. Next is, if a rising 12th grader is exceptional in music talent with a music professor's recommendation, but the GPA is 3.4, is it possible for Harvard and Stanford? That's going to be really tough with that GPA, unfortunately. Even with a music professor's recommendation, unless they're really, truly, truly exceptional and there is a specific need for the university to want to recruit that student. But I would probably venture to say that the vast majority of students that are being seriously considered for Harvard and Stanford will probably have no lower than a 3.5. 3.75 is even cutting it, right? Even with 3.75, you'd have to be truly extraordinary to be able to get in. So 3.4 might actually be, yeah, that might be a little too out of the range, but you just never know, right? So I think this is definitely where, if the musical talent is really strong, plus there is a need, right? So it's not just that they're good at something. If they really feel like they want the student in one of those schools, it could be a possibility. I just don't feel like it's very likely with that GPA, unfortunately. Okay. And lastly, is Purdue good in computer science? Oh yeah, absolutely. Purdue is generally widely considered probably top 10 for undergrad computer science, top 15 at the very worst, right? So I think most years they're probably a top 10 undergrad CS program. So Purdue would be an excellent choice. It is getting harder these days, to be honest, right? So if you do want to apply for Purdue for computer science, we highly recommend that you apply for early action, because we've seen statistics shared directly by Purdue's admissions office that the bulk, I would say probably about 90% of the students who are getting accepted in the freshman class for computer science are accepted in the early action round, and only about 10% are left. So that by regular decision, the acceptance rate is significantly lower if you're, trying to apply for Purdue specifically for computer science. Okay. So if you want to enhance your chances, I highly recommend that you apply for early action for Purdue. Okay. All right. So I think that's pretty much all the time we have for tonight. Thanks again. And